And so to orient us, in 1954, the Columbia Point Peninsula became the site of the Columbia Point Housing Project, the largest of its kind in New England at that time. From its inception, the racially mixed housing project was in isolation. Surrounded by open fields, the landfill, and water, Columbia Point opened without a grocery store, shops, a bank, school, church, healthcare, or public transportation. What the peninsula lacked in terms of services, the residents, in particular the Mothers Club, played an important role in securing. Next slide, please. The purpose of this case study is to tell the stories of the unsung African-American sheroes and heroes who worked tirelessly to provide equitable services to their low-income families living in the Columbia Point housing projects throughout the 1960s and 70s. This is evidenced through the efforts of Black community members who demanded public safety, educational resources, and quality housing. Mothers went to City Hall demanding more police protection, as imaged in the photo in the top left-hand corners. Families went to the Boston Housing Authority to protest the housing authority's aggressive neglect of the Columbia Point housing project, as seen in the top photograph on the right. Residents also demanded the creation of preschool and after-school programs that provided the quality of inclusion education Black and Brown children deserved and needed, and which was not taught in public schools. Our case study comprises a melange of Black voice in newspapers, television programs, petitions, amongst other primary and secondary sources. Here, we situate the teacher as inquirer. Our case study encourages students and teachers to conduct rigorous inquiry-based exploration and study concerning the questions that arise from thinking critically about what history tells us, how that knowledge impacts questions and solutions we have about our present in order to create positive possibilities for the future concerning Black community development in the city of Boston. In short, this work respects the teacher and student as thinker, scholar, and generator of knowledge based on the materials of our case study. And now I will transition back over to Dr. Patman, who will begin a discussion about what brought each of us to the case study.
Thank you very, very much, Christian. So there, in the interest of time, really quickly, there were three things that motivated me to join this research team to create this case study. First of all, I lived in Boston at the time when Columbia Point was notorious. It shared space with the newly constructed UMass Boston, and I was curious about how the university would interface with low-income Black residents. What type of interdependence could there be on what was previously the city dump? Second of all, gentrification is happening everywhere, even today. But I was particularly interested in the dramatic change from Columbia Point to Harbor Point and what will emerge into the city within the city of Boston with big plans charted for this area for the future. So the story of white families who lived in Columbia Point were well documented, but the African-American stories would be lost, stolen, and or strayed if they were not documented with dignity. And finally, and most importantly, as for me, this photo that you see in this slide, I was drawn to this project because I wanted to highlight the strengths of Black mothers and their ability to advocate and organize for their children and families. The dominant narrative at that time painted a picture of women, of Black women, as being ignorant, unrefined, and welfare queens. I knew that this was untrue. I knew that I had to, and many, many other women, Black mothers in particular, had to chart different routes to dignity. So it would be a privilege for me to capture some of their stories. Black women, and in this photo, are members of the SMART set who held a conclave here in Boston in 1966 at the Buckminster Hotel to support the interests of Black families, and particular the needs of students, of children. Now we'll turn to Christian to get some of his thoughts about why it was important for him to do this research.
Absolutely. And so, first and foremost, what brought me to this case study is my life story, being born in Dorchester, being an undergraduate student at UMass Boston, but not hearing much about the Columbia Point neighborhood. Even though I had friends who grew up there were these sort of negative associations and not many positive stories about the community. And so, as a scholar training in the field of Black studies, I thought this would be an excellent opportunity to reverse that scripts of pathology and look at this community from its strength. And boy, has it been a beautiful time learning the strengths of this community, the mothers, the families, the children. And so that is what brought me to this case study, learning more about where I come from and where I have been to think about where I would like to go in the future. And I'll pass it over to Debbie Ferdinand.
Thank you, Christian. So when I was initially called to this project, I did some initial reading on the work of William Monroe Trotter, an advocate for change and a vessel for the voices of Black Boston at the time. While reading sources on Columbia Point, I came across a small fragment of information that has stuck with me since, that the Columbia Point community uplifted themselves through means of grassroots organizing before this term was even conceptualized. Learning the history of Black activism within the context of their own communities allows students to see themselves within past community leaders and empower a new generation of future Black leaders, activists, and change makers. And I will pass it over to Michael.
Thanks. What's particularly compelling for me about Columbia Point is that it represents all of America's ambitions and contradictions and successes and failures regarding social housing, decent, affordable housing available to all. So on this slide, I show images of Columbia Point on the right and the Chicago public housing community of Cabrini Green on the right. And I think both cases illustrate that Black people were never really part of the social contract that produced public housing in the early and middle 20th century, and became associated with institutional failures of public housing in the late 20th century. In many cities, public housing was demolished to be replaced by mixed income housing that provided limited opportunities for former public housing residents and represented what I view as Black cultural erasure. How can we tell the story about vibrant communities whose residents organized to provide opportunities for their children?